Welcome back to Citizen One, exploring our urban future. I'm your host, Douglas Stewart McDaniel. I admit, without apology, that it has been a while. I've been writing, mostly. The Southern Civic Noir trilogy is finally out and getting really nice reviews. Defiance, The Darkwater Gospel, and Bloodwater. 3 books about power and memory in the American South that took the better part of 2 years to get right. Make sure to check out the profile on insideofknoxville.com on the Darkwater Gospel. And this summer, Maxim van Shamrai's new novel comes out, Scions of the Last Hope, Eastern European science fiction from a Ukrainian writer I'm very proud to be publishing. The rest of the time I've been on planes and trains, consulting in Australia and New York, 2 cities with very different ideas about what they're becoming, both of which I'll get into in the weeks ahead, and building out premium pulp fiction, bringing on new authors, writers who know where the genre comes from and where they want to take it. That's where I've been. Now let's get back to it. Here's what I'm thinking about, sitting in economy on this well-equipped China Eastern Airbus A350 tonight, while everyone around me is sleeping. Shanghai. Shanghai in the 1930s was really something strange and mysterious. It was where the stories happened, the intelligence thrillers, the spy novels, the adventure fiction that a certain kind of American or British writer produced for a certain kind of reader who would never go anywhere near Shanghai but wanted very much to feel like they might. Shanghai was where the competent man operated, where the threat was real and exotic and geopolitical, where the woman in the hotel bar was either an asset or a liability, and the wise operative knew which before he finished his drink. That genre had a name, loosely. It still does. We call it pulp fiction, not Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, though I'll note for the record that Tarantino is from Knoxville, same as me, which may say something about how that city twists a person's relationship with genre and violence and the stories people tell to explain both. His films are generally grindhouse masterpieces of a very specific kind, postmodern, referential, in love with the surface of the pulp tradition rather than its structure. That's one way to work with a tradition. That is not what I am doing with Premium Pulp Fiction, my startup publishing disruptor. When I say pulp fiction, I mean the thing itself, the original, the source material, the actual wood pulp magazines, and the writers who built narrative machinery inside them that is still running. And I want to start with my great uncle. His name was John Allen Maxwell. He was an illustrator, one of the significant commercial illustrators of the mid-20th century, working across a range of publications and book projects that, when you list them out, gives you a fairly complete map of what American readers were consuming between roughly 1930 and 1960. He was also from East Tennessee. He illustrated for John Steinbeck, for Edna Ferber, for Aldous Huxley, for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for Thomas B. Costain, for Frank Yerby, for C.S. Forrester, and for F. Van Wyck Mason, specifically the Colonel Hugh North series of intelligence thrillers, a run of novels that began in 1930 and continued for nearly 5 decades. Mason thought enough of Maxwell to write him into a scene by name. In the Bucharest Ballerina Murders, Maxwell appears as himself, a small act of authorial affection that tells you something about how these working relationships operated. The illustrator wasn't just a vendor, he was part of the machinery. He understood the material. He was trusted with the visual language of the world the novelist had built. I find that remarkably intimate pulp fiction, unabashedly illustrating for Pulitzer and Nobel Prize winners, along with pulp fiction novelists. Some of those names live in the literary canon. Even the reprints of those prize winners inhabit used bookstore bins, their spines faded, their covers illustrated by some forgotten artist like my great uncle, selling for $1 or $2 to readers who still remember them. Some first editions are still valuable, like Hervey Allen's Anthony Adverse, which knocked Gone with the Wind off the bestseller list in 1933 or 34. Uncle John illustrated the first edition. N.C. Wyeth snagged the commission for the second edition. But John Allen Maxwell moved between all of them without apparently drawing a distinction or giving much of a damn. He just wanted to paint. He illustrated what he was commissioned to illustrate. That's the first argument I want to make tonight. The hierarchy was always downstream of the publisher's illustration budget. Let me back up and give you the lineage properly, because it matters for understanding what premium pulp fiction is trying to do. The genre we're talking about, the globe-trotting intelligence thriller, the competent man in foreign terrain adventure novel, the moral consequence action narrative, doesn't begin with Ian Fleming. It doesn't begin with F. Van Wyck Mason either. It has deeper roots, and tracing them tells you something about how genre actually works, which is less like a family tree and more like a river system. Multiple tributaries, shared sediment. The water at the mouth is the water of everywhere it's been. Start with John Buchan, The 39 Steps, a classic 1915 spy thriller by John Buchan, adapted many times by Alfred Hitchcock. Buchan introduces Richard Hannay, a mining engineer who gets caught up in a heist of British military secrets before World War I. A spy gets murdered in his flat. Our protagonist escapes to the Scottish countryside, chased by police and spies as he races to prevent a national disaster. If this sounds like the 1993 film The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford, you're right. It does. This episode is a brief history of the spy thriller pulp fiction canon, told by one of its descendants who dared to launch an indie traditional publishing venture that doesn't gouge authors with pay to play hybrid models. If your story is good enough, we'll give it a fair read. Buchan's Richard Hannay is a capable man, physically competent, ideologically certain, placed under existential pressure by forces larger than himself, and required to navigate them through a combination of resourcefulness and an almost constitutional inability to quit. Buchan gave the genre its basic grammar: the chase, the competent loner, England or Western civilization under threat, the landscape as both obstacle and character. Buchan was writing out of a specific moment in the First World War, the fracturing of a certain kind of imperial confidence, and the genre he produced was shaped by that fracture. His heroes aren't invulnerable. They're capable. There's a difference. Capability implies the possibility of failure, which implies stakes, which implies story. From Buchan, the line runs several directions simultaneously. In Britain, it runs through H.C. McNeill, better known as Sapper. His Hugh Bulldog Drummond novels influenced authors like Ian Fleming and W.E. Johns, who said that their characters James Bond and Biggles were largely based on Drummond. Bulldog Drummond is less interesting than Buchan's Hannay, honestly. He's Hannay with the complexity drained out and the violence cranked up, but he sold. He sold enormously. And he established a particular flavor of the genre, the gentleman operative, casually brutal, politically unambiguous, that would run underground through the culture for decades and resurface in Fleming with considerably better prose attached. In America, the line runs differently. It runs through the magazines, specifically through Adventure, which between roughly 1910 and 1940 was publishing some of the most geographically specific, operationally detailed adventure fiction being written anywhere. Writers like Talbot Mundy and Harold Lamb and Arthur O. Friel were producing work for adventure that understood the world as a system of places, each with its own history and logic and danger. Mundy's Jim Grimm series, an intelligence operative working across the Middle East in the aftermath of the First World War, is Hugh North without the military rank, and arguably with more moral intelligence. This is where F. Van Wyck Mason enters. F. Van Wyck Mason was an adventure magazine writer who transitioned into the novel form. His Colonel Hugh North, introduced in Seeds of Murder in 1930, is a G2 officer, American military intelligence, operating across a world of embassies and ballrooms and backstreets where the real business of nations gets conducted. North is competent, physically capable, ideologically reliable, and perpetually deployed somewhere that isn't Washington. He operates through expertise and institutional loyalty, he reports up. He is, in the structural sense, a professional. The North novels ran from 1930 to 1977, nearly 5 decades. That kind of longevity requires something beyond formula. It requires a writer who can update the geopolitics, who can keep the threat credible, who can age the character without losing him. Mason did this. North moves from the pre-war world through the Cold War with enough flexibility to remain functional as a protagonist. That's craft, whatever else you want to say about the prose. Mason was not original in the way we use that word when we mean it as a compliment. He was working squarely inside an established tradition, Buchan, Mundy, the adventure magazine stable, and producing competent, consistent work within that tradition. What he contributed was longevity and reliability. The North novels are what they are, clearly without apology, for 50 years, and my great-uncle illustrated them, brought the visual language, made Hugh North's world legible to the reader before the first page was turned. Now, Ian Fleming. Fleming is the point where this lineage becomes famous, which is both its vindication and, in some ways, its distortion. Fleming was English, naval intelligence, wartime experience that gave him an operational texture the adventure writers before him mostly lacked. He was also a voracious reader of exactly this tradition. Buchan, Sapper, Mundy, Mason, the motor novels of John P. Marquand, and he synthesized it with several things none of his predecessors had quite combined. The first was prose style. Fleming wrote with a particular kind of sensory precision, attentive to brand names, to food, to the texture of hotel rooms and casino floors, that was closer to journalism than to genre fiction. He had worked as a journalist. It showed. Bond doesn't simply drink. He drinks a specific thing, prepared a specific way, for reasons that tell you something about who he is and what he values. That granular materiality was Fleming's signature, and it's why the novels read differently from their predecessors, even when the underlying structure is nearly identical. The second was the Cold War. Fleming took the Buchan grammar, civilization under existential threat, the capable loner as last line of defense, and reloaded it with nuclear anxiety and ideological bifurcation. The threat became genuinely global in a way that Buchan's threats, for all their drama, never quite were. Smersh, Spectre, the apparatus of planetary destruction run by men who sat in underground lairs and planned the end of everything. This is Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu scaled up to accommodate the hydrogen bomb. The third was sex, handled with a frankness that the earlier tradition had either avoided or coded heavily. Fleming's women are a problem, that's a longer conversation, but their presence in the novels as explicit, rather than decorative, was a genuine departure from what Mason and Mundy and the adventure magazine writers had been doing. Fleming synthesized all of this and produced something that felt new, even though its components were largely inherited. That's what good genre synthesis does. It recombines the available materials at a high enough level of craft that the recombination becomes its own thing. Did Fleming plagiarize? The short answer is, not exactly, and once. The once was Thunderball, where he used material developed collaboratively with Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham as if it were solely his. He lost that argument in court, or rather settled it, and the consequences, McClory's perpetual ownership of the Thunderball film rights, Never Say Never Again, decades of legal entanglement, followed the Bond franchise for the rest of the 20th century. It's one of the stranger intellectual property stories in popular culture, and it has the particular shape of disputes where everyone involved knew what happened and nobody wanted to say it plainly. The rest, the debts to Buchan, to Sapper, to Mundy, to Mason, those aren't plagiarism. Those are genre. Eve Rywriter in a tradition is downstream of the tradition. The question is what you do with the water. Which brings me to Tom Clancy, because this week, Amazon dropped Jack Ryan, Ghost War, a film, not a novel, John Krasinski back in the role. And it's doing what Clancy properties do, which is remind you that the tradition is still running, still commercially viable, still finding audiences who want exactly what Buchan was providing in 1915, updated for whatever the current geopolitical anxiety happens to be. Clancy started with The Hunt for Red October in 1984. I remember buying his novels from a newsstand near the Pentagon when I was working at the Navy Annex. That detail matters to me now in a way it didn't then. I was buying genre fiction, competent man fiction, institutional loyalty fiction, the American military intelligence apparatus as protagonist, 50 yards from the actual American military intelligence apparatus. The genre and the reality were that close to each other geographically, and nobody seemed to find it strange. Clancy's particular contribution to the lineage was technical specificity. Where Fleming had luxury brands and casino atmospherics, Clancy had weapon systems and submarine propulsion and the precise organizational structure of the Soviet Naval Command. His readers didn't just want the story, they wanted to feel like they understood how things actually worked. The machinery of geopolitical power rendered in enough operational detail to feel authentic. That's a different kind of materialism than Fleming's, but it's the same underlying impulse, the genre detail as proof of seriousness. And Clancy, like every writer in this tradition, imagined forward. This is the part that matters. In Debt of Honor, published in 1994, a Japanese airlines pilot flies a Boeing 747 into the United States Capitol building during a joint session of Congress. The president is killed. Most of Congress, the Supreme Court, Jack Ryan, minutes earlier confirmed as the new vice president, survives and is sworn in as president in a CNN studio. 7 years later, Condoleezza Rice went before Congress and said, with a straight face, that no one could have imagined terrorists using aircraft as weapons against American targets. Tom Clancy imagined it in 1994 and sold it to millions of readers from newsstands near the Pentagon. The Designated Survivor premise, the Kiefer Sutherland series that ran 3 seasons, is a direct descendant of that Debt of Honor ending. One survivor of a catastrophic attack on the government, suddenly president, trying to hold a country together without a functioning state apparatus. Clancy wrote it first. Television caught up 20 years later. This is what the tradition does at its best. It runs slightly ahead of reality, not because the writers are prophets, but because they're paying attention to systems, to how power actually works, to what the failure modes are, to what happens when the machinery breaks down. Clancy understood the American national security apparatus as a system, the way Mason understood the interwar diplomatic world as a system, the way Buchan understood the British intelligence apparatus in wartime as a system. The genre has always been systems thinking dressed as entertainment. That's not a bug, that's the engine. Ghost War is the latest iteration. Krasinski, who played Ryan on television for 4 seasons, carries the character into a film about a rogue Black Ops unit and a conspiracy that pulls a retired analyst back into the machinery he thought he'd left behind. The reviews are mixed. Apparently it's better on character than on plotting, which is a very Clancy problem. His own novels ran to 1,000 pages and still sometimes felt underplotted. But it's #1 on Amazon Prime in the United States this week, which tells you the audience is still there. The lineage runs. Buchan to Mason to Fleming to Clancy to Krasinski in a film that dropped 6 days ago while I was somewhere over the Pacific, unable to tell you what time it was. Here's what I want to say about the word pulp. It's a production term. It refers to the cheap paper, wood-pulp paper, on which the American magazines of the early 20th century were printed. Argosy, Adventure, Black Mask, Weird Tales. The pulps, as they were called, printed fiction cheaply for mass audiences, paid writers by the word, and operated on a model of volume and velocity that encouraged a certain kind of writing. Fast, propulsive, built on formula, delivered on deadline. Some of the writers who worked in this system were hacks. Some were writers of genuine talent who happened to need money, which is most writers at most times. Raymond Chandler published his first stories in Black Mask. Dashiell Hammett built the hard-boiled detective novel in the same pages. Chandler, in particular, his prose is among the most precisely crafted American fiction of the century, and it appeared first on wood-pulp paper alongside stories that nobody reads anymore. The pulp/literary distinction was enforced not by quality, but by venue and price point. Hardcover fiction with a dust jacket and a review in the Times was literature. Magazines on cheap paper were pulp. The same story, the same writer, could cross that line depending on where it appeared and who was paying attention. John Allen Maxwell illustrated both sides of that line simultaneously, without apparent discomfort. Steinbeck on one commission, Mason on another. That's not a small thing. That's evidence. The illustrator sees the manuscript. The illustrator reads the work and translates it into image. My great-uncle's career is a 40-year argument that the distinction between pulp and literature was always a distribution question, not an aesthetic one. The craft was the craft. Premium pulp fiction was named deliberately. The name is a provocation and a position. It says, we take the pulp tradition seriously as a tradition. We understand that genre is a working tool rather than a marketing category. We know where the form comes from, the magazines, the illustrators, the writers who built narrative machinery that still runs, and we publish work that knows it too. Our editorial statement says we're interested in stories that know where they come from. Noir that remembers its debts. Historical fiction that treats the past as something lived rather than staged. Speculative work that understands systems, worlds, and story ecologies before it imagines their collapse. That's the Mason through Fleming lineage stated as a publishing philosophy. Work that operates within a tradition while understanding that tradition clearly enough to extend it rather than merely repeat it. The catalog we're building reflects this. The Southern Civic Noir trilogy, Defiance, The Dark Water Gospel, Bloodwater, understands its debts to the noir tradition, to the Southern Gothic, to the specific grammar of civic corruption and moral consequence that runs from Faulkner through Elroy through the courthouse records of actual American towns. Ghost Emperor, set in Babylon in 323 BCE, is historical fiction that treats ancient political systems as systems, the machinery of empire, succession, loyalty, and collapse, rather than as costume drama. Maxime van Shamrai's Signs of the Last Hope comes out of the Eastern European science fiction tradition, displacement literature, and philosophical anthropology. It knows where it comes from. That's the criterion. We publish a small number of titles. Each one earns its place not by fitting a trend, but by understanding a tradition and doing something with it. That's premium pulp fiction. That's what the name means. Genre fiction has always been collaborative in ways that literary fiction prefers not to acknowledge. The pulp magazines ran because writers and illustrators and editors worked together at speed, each depending on the others, each contributing to a shared project that none of them could have completed alone. The novels that came out of that tradition carry that collaboration in their DNA, even when only one name appears on the cover. John Allen Maxwell illustrated Steinbeck and Mason without apparently finding the distinction significant. The work was the work. The craft was the craft. That's the tradition I'm publishing inside. That's the lineage I want premium pulp fiction to carry forward. I'm going to finish this coffee, and then I'm going to get on a plane to Melbourne, which is another city with a story it tells about itself, and I'm going to think about what gets built when people decide that the stories worth telling are the ones that know where they come from. Join the Substack, and if you have a manuscript that knows its debts, send it our way. And that's a wrap on this episode of Citizen One, exploring our urban future. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel. Make sure to join our Substack at www.citizenone.world, where you can learn more about our new books, projects, and world travel adventures from my Instagram feed. I'll see you again soon.